Welcome to the Businesstalk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. We are honored to welcome Professor David Silver from the University of British Columbia as our distinguished guest on today's podcast. Dr. David holds the chair in business and professional ethics at the University of British Columbia's W. Morris Young Center for Applied Ethics and is jointly appointed to the Souther School of Business. He is also an associate member of the University of British Columbia Department of Philosophy. Dr. Silver earned his PhD in philosophy from the University of Arizona in 1997. His doctoral research titled A Virtue Theory of Practical Reason explores the intersections of metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, reflecting his enduring interest in the philosophical foundations of ethical decision-making and professional integrity. His current research focuses on the business corporation and its role within democratic society. His persons-based theory of the firm explores how we can understand the corporation in a way that fosters a society which is humane, and democratic. In this episode, Dr. David Silver shares insights from his newly published book, Corporations and Persons, A Theory of the Firm in Democratic Society. It's my pleasure to now welcome Dr. David Silver to the conversation. Dr. David, we are truly honored that you have accepted our invitation and delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Professor, your book argues that corporations should be seen as a morally responsible persons. What philosophical foundations support this claim, and how does this framing differ from traditional economic or legal conceptions of the firm?
Great. Yeah, thank you for the question. And so I began my career, I still am a philosopher, but thinking about these questions about ethics, morality, where does it fit into the world? And one of the things I became very interested in is before I was thinking about business and corporations, it's just about human beings. And there's a long-standing worry that maybe if we understand the world deeply enough and we understand our place in the world, then we find out that human beings, you and I, are not morally responsible. We're just caused to do, in the great causal chain of being. Uh, and that's a very powerful and ancient argument that has a lot of sway. And some, I would say, recent developments in philosophy that are going back 60 years now to P.F. Strawson in his famous work, Freedom and Resentment, is saying that this way of thinking really misses something. That if we just think of human beings as caught up and forced to go by physics or chemistry or biology or whatever, we're losing something important, something moral in the way we relate to each other. So Strawson started a way of thinking in philosophy of how we reorient our thinking towards what is human, what is moral, what is relational, right? And recovered, in my view, and a lot of people's view, the idea that human beings are morally responsible for what we do. My own work, and this goes back some time, extends that idea to say if we think about business, which is a major part of our lives, and we just think of it how it's embedded in economics and law and politics, we will then do that same mistake of saying it's just something that's pushed along, and we lose the fact that it is an organization that's capable of making decisions. It is morally responsible in the way that we are. Right. So that's the approach I take is a reorienting philosophy away from just studying the world to how do we relate within it. And that gets to your second question of how does this differ from, let's say, economic or legal conceptions of the firm. So I'm providing a normative theory of the firm. And that normative theory is not just studying the business, like what's it going to do? Let's predict what it's done. Let's explain what it's done. Again, if you just do that to the human being, you lose the humanity. So how do we come and look at the corporation? Yes, study it from the economic and legal and political science and sociological perspective, but let's not lose that it is that we stand in relation with corporations and they stand in relation with us. And that's how my approach fundamentally differs.
Professor, you propose that the fundamental purpose of the firm is to create products and services that benefit human persons. How might this persons-based view reshape business strategy and performance metrics in practice?
Okay, so yeah, so that's one of the things when I started this project, I didn't know I was going to say this. What is the purpose of the firm? And what I argue is that the fundamental purpose is to create products and services that benefit, for the most part, human beings. It could be animals or other. Um, and I want to be clear, though, that this is a reorientation of an understanding of the firm. It's not a rejection of its profit orientation, right? So I do believe that corporations have a moral duty to responsibly manage their firms, their activity, in a way that returns a reasonable profit to their shareholders. And all those words we can, delve into is what's responsible, what's reasonable. But I do think corporations need to make money, right? But their fundamental purpose is not to make money. In the same way, you and I need to eat, or similar. We need to eat, but that's not our purpose. It's not a perfect analogy, but so the fundamental purpose is that place when we go to work as human beings, we want to be doing things for other people. Right? And making money for other people is a good thing, right? But it's not the kind of thing that we want to do on our work, which is a more direct kind of service. So if you're in a pharmaceutical company, the fundamental purpose would be to create drugs that maintain or improve health, right? And if you worked at a place like that, you could get up every day and say, I understand why I'm going to work. Now, an added benefit is that you're creating profits for shareholders and jobs for employees and benefits in the community. Those are all great, but the fundamental purpose, that thing that we are our lives are less good if we don't have it, is that being oriented towards helping people in some way. So what would that mean in terms of changing metrics, right? Well, the first thing is that it would take away a focus on just focusing on money, right? Focus on money, yes, but not just focusing on money. So the question will be not just how much money are we making, but also how are we making this money? How can we find strategies that make money in alignment with our values and our responsibilities, right? And so, again, a reorientation, not a rejection of the fundamentally, from the profit orientation of the firm. And this will change things in terms of the way business managers think and the way they act. So they might think instead of, all right, if we're going to, let's say, have um, we're going to think about something in terms of sustainability. You're not just going to think, oh, how is the public going to accept this? And is this going to affect our reputation in the long term? Those are all super important. But you're also going to think, what's our role in creating a sustainable economy? What's our responsibility to people alive today and to future generations? It's going to reorient the thinking. So I would put it there is the fundamental reorientation is about how we think about business. It's a human activity that benefits people, makes money for shareholders, reflects democratic decisions, respects people's, animals, the environment, and future generations. That's what this theory, what I call the persons-based theory, will invite business managers to do rather than just focus solely on profits.
Professor, the book suggests that corporations' rights and duties are shaped through democratic processes. Could you elaborate on what a genuinely democratic corporate governance model might look like?
Okay, so thank you for asking that question. And there's an important distinction in the book which I'd like to make, right? So there are a lot of theorists who think that if you really want to have human and democratic economy, then we need to democratize the corporation. And that might take the form maybe as in a German co-determination arrangement where labor has a seat at the board, or there are other proposals where community members come into the board, or even the government having a seat at the table, and that you make the governance of the board more democratic. That's not. I'm not saying don't do that, but that's not what I'm saying. When I talk about democratic governance of the corporation, I'm talking at the society level. We need to have active democratic control of what corporate governance is going to look like, what the rules for corporations are going to look like. We need to have active democratic governance of the extent that for-profit corporations play a role in society. So, for example, do they play a role in education? In some societies, yes. Some societies, no. Do they play a role in healthcare? Same thing. Some societies, yes. Some societies, no. Um, is there a right or wrong answer? No. In my view, that's something that should be debated at the democratic level. People will disagree invariably, and that we decide that through fair democratic processes. So, just one additional element that I think is really important to bring up here is that whether you decide to have workers in your corporate governance model, or it's going to be a co-op, or whether they're going to have a shareholder-centric model, there's no perfect answer there. These all involve trade-offs. You know, economists love to talk about trade-offs, and business ethicists don't always like to, but I do. There are always trade-offs if you arrange in terms of efficiency, in terms of respecting meaningfulness of work, respecting also the sustainability. There's all sorts of ways of trade-offs, and that has those trade-offs need to be discussed and debated at the democratic level, and saying this is how in our society we're going to organize the firm to deal with those trade-offs.
Dr. David, you contrast democratic prerogatives with the market's logic of competition and efficiency. How can democratic societies reconcile these two forces without undermining innovation or economic growth?
Okay, great question. So there are many ways of thinking about markets and firms where they're run by a logic of competition and efficiency. So this might be, I don't think it's all economists, but it's a lot of people, a lot of economists and people who are influenced by economic thinking. We'll see, the old joke that business ethics is an oxymoron, right? Why? Because if you really understood markets and competition, you would see that firms and everyone within the market are just going to try to get their own advantage, right? And so I think this is a mistake, right? That firms do, as I was saying before, there's a reorientation where firms and market actors do need to be seeking profits and money, or if you're a person, a salary, right? But that there are other values that come into play. Okay? And it's up to democratic societies to balance all these. So I'll give you a few examples of how this balancing act. The most fundamental is the question of whether we're going to have a capitalist society or not. And let me just define my terms. By capitalism, I mean a society where for-profit corporations, these great poolers of capital, are able to play a significant role. Are we going to have a capitalist society or not? And there are trade-offs, right? You get the tremendous efficiency and productivity of market-based capitalism, but it also brings all the well-known ills of such a society. Those are trade-offs, and it is up to a society to decide whether they want, or affirm whether they want to have businesses and corporations playing a large role in their society. And they also have a role of saying, but in these sectors, again, health or education, are off limits if they choose to make that decision. Okay. Those are all balancing considerations of productivity and efficiency. These decisions happen throughout, I talk about throughout the book. So when you're making regulations on corporations, it's always a balance between efficiency and other values. So take when you're regulating pollution. You might just say, we're going to ban the ability of, let's say, a mining industry to use certain chemicals. But if you do that, then you don't get the ore that you need. So you might say, well, we're going to set a price for using these chemicals, and that's going to keep it down to a safe level. That is a trade-off between efficiency and health and environment that democracies can and should make and do make all the time. I'll just make one more point on this, is that democratic societies make these decisions all the time, including in things that say like a minimum wage, right? There's a question, is the minimum wage going to increase efficiency or reduce efficiency? In a way, it doesn't matter if it's going to make more dignified work for all. And so you might set a minimum wage here and find out that it really does reduce efficiency more than you want to, right? Or you might set it too low and find that people are lacking dignified work. And so that's one of the virtues, I think, of democracy, is that it has a self-correcting mechanism. It can try things out, hit a bounce, a certain set of trade-offs, see how it works out in practice, and then if it isn't working for people, then through the democratic process, they can say, that didn't work. We need more regulation. We need less regulation. We need higher taxes. We need lower taxes. That can all be played out through the democratic process.
Professor, you describe the current relationship between corporations and democratic society as dysfunctional. What are the most pressing symptoms of this dysfunction, and where do you see the most promising opportunities for repair?
Okay. Wow. Okay. So there's a lot there. As I do describe the relationship as dysfunctional. I came to make an analogy over the course of the writing the book, which I didn't necessarily, you know, intend at the beginning, of comparing the relationship between capitalism and democracy to a human relationship. And human relationships, by the way, you have the copy of the book cover in the background, which has the Boston Tea Party, and the ships represent the British East India Company, and the and the and the people in the docks represent democracy. We also have some of the colonists dressed as Native Americans, and that's a complicated thing I discussed in the book. But what I tried to capture through that image was that there's a relationship going on between businesses and human beings, and so that's where I get this language of dysfunction. This is a relationship that is dysfunctional, but through work, let's call it therapeutic work, again, not my natural way of thinking about things, we can repair this relationship. So, just in my own experience in my adult life, I've seen several crises of capitalism. There was the Enron era of the early 2000s when I was still in a philosophy department. And for a short period of time, it's as company after company, admired company after company was collapsing in fraud and bankruptcy. It really seemed that trust in the system was being withered away. We couldn't trust anything. Now that moment passed very quickly, and but shortly, just a few years later, 2008, so really a blink in time, we had the global financial crisis, and um, and so that was a case, and maybe I'll talk a little bit about this in a little bit later on, but that was another moment where it seemed like there were, at least in my estimation, I do argue this, that a lot of businesses were taking a lot of risks with in gaining all the upside and not bearing any of the downside. That was borne by everybody else. And so I look at this and I saw a through line here of that the firms in both the Enron era and the global financial crisis were not respecting what I called their democratic duties. They were not following the law, at least in a full way. They were not respecting the spirit of the law. When people came in to try to change the law, then they would lobby or make campaign donations that prevent people from fixing the system. And that all, in my opinion, is a sign of dysfunction. It's not understanding the way things are supposed to work in that relationship. And it was manifesting itself in crisis after crisis. And perhaps we may be on our timeline ready for a new one. I can't predict that, but these are short timelines. So the first dysfunction that I saw was the failure to adhere to these, what I call democratic duties. Since I've finished the book, which I finished in September 2024, there's been two new developments that have layered on what I see as this dysfunction. One has been the open antagonism of many, especially in the tech space, the open antagonism towards democracy. Right? That is a sign of dysfunction. Right? If that were in a human relationship, it would be, that would be a pretty bad state. Um, and the other thing that I talk about, and I've written a piece for an online magazine called The Conversation. Maybe you can put a link up to it for people. And the title is Businesses Have a Duty to Stand Up to Authoritarians or Autocrats, one of those. And so, since what I'm looking into part of this dysfunction is I do argue in the book that businesses have a duty to stand up And as an American, I live in Canada, I work in Canada, but I'm an American. Um, and I'm watching businesses, not all of them, but many of them fail in this duty, right? To stand up. And I understand the situation is complicated and decisions are hard, but that is an increasing sign of dysfunction.
Professor, when corporations fail to recognize their democratic duties, you argue they can threaten liberal democratic institutions. Could you share an examples of where this failure is most visible today?
Okay, great. Yeah, so this was another kind of thing I discovered in the process of writing the book. I mean, it was a thought I had. Is so on one level, I argue things like businesses have a responsibility not just to follow the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. Okay, all right. I argue that businesses, in a sense, have a right, an abstract right, to engage in democratic politics, but they shouldn't do so in a way where they break the democratic nature of the system by putting in too much money, right? For example, or crowding out other voices out of the system. So on a certain level, I was just articulating what these duties are. What I came to realize over time is that there was a second level duty or a second level concern is that when firms should just act on their democratic duties, um, um, but when they don't systematically, this has an effect on society. So a couple examples that I focus on in the book, throughout the book, is one, for example, is corporate taxes. So I look at the rise and spread of behavior within a large part of the corporate community, especially again, I focus on United States and Delaware in particular, but this applies more generally. Um, of companies figuring out ways of getting around the spirit of the tax code. The spirit of the tax code says you pay whatever X percent, 15, 20, 25% of your profits. And it's a democratic decision. Democracy could decide zero, they could decide 50%, but whatever they decide, they decide. And one of the things I've seen is that how companies have figured out ways to bring that down to effectively to zero. Right? Not because they're not making profits, it's because they figured out ways of getting around the spirit of that code. All right. So I don't think they should do that. All right. Very controversial, so on. But I also think it has an effect. Is that every few years, again, in the American context, various business leaders or accounting firms get hauled in front of Congress and they'd say, why aren't you paying taxes? And they say, look, we're just following the law, yada, yada, yada. But the people out who are watching these, it has an effect. They say, I make, whatever, some small amount of money and I pay lots of taxes. And here they're paying none. And that starts to accumulate. And then we take another thing, this was very foundational for me, was thinking it's about something like the global financial crisis, where they saw that there were lots of firms making decisions that led to the crisis. I would say irresponsible and immoral choices, right? And that when it all broke, the banks were bailed out and the common people were not, right? So I speculate, and it's really just speculate, that this has a toll on people where they come to see that this whole idea of this liberal democracy said they had our back, right? But they are either unwilling or unable to protect us. So, again, the thesis is then people start looking for authoritarians, whether on the political right or on the political left, who will vindicate them, who will say, I will get this done. And so, looking from a kind of a political economy, sort of political um, point of view, the failure of firms to act in a democratic society weakens democratic society. And so that's what I write about in the book. And then the second thing, just going back to your question, is right now in this moment when autocrats or aspiring autocrats are seeking to gain power, um, I argue, I believe, right, it's up to all of society, all of democratic society to stand up, right? Because we either stand up together or we fall together. And businesses hold a tremendous amount of power in society. And so when they kneel down, it makes it harder for others to stand up. And that makes free society, and for that matter, a free market, imperiled.
Professor, granting moral rights to corporations is often controversial. How do you distinguish between rights that are necessary for corporate moral agency and those that might give firms excessive power in democratic life?
Okay, yeah. So interesting question. So I do think there are certain rights that are necessary for corporations to function. Certain property rights, certain legal rights. And in a way, that's for me, is part of the definition of a corporation. It's a business entity that has a certain legal status as a person that can own property and enter contracts. So the property rights are fundamental. But there's the question is once you have the idea that property rights are fundamental, it's up to democratic society to determine what those property rights are going to look like. Let's just go back to that taxation case, right? Um, it's up to each society to determine how they're going to tax corporate profits, if they're going to tax it at all. It could be high, low, medium, who knows, right? That's comes up against the idea of property, right? What does it mean to have property? Well, you're going to be taxed, and you're going to be taxed at the rate we determined. So you have a right, but it's democratically determined. Um, Perhaps of a little broader interest, I do talk about political and religious rights, but I'll talk a little bit about political rights. I do think, on my theory that I put forward, that corporations have what I call abstract political rights. That basically any democratic society is going to let them or require them even to participate in democratic politics in some way. And that's for a variety of reasons, as corporations know a tremendous amount about their industries and about problems that are emerging before the rest of society. And citizens have a real interest in hearing what corporations have to say in the political sphere. So that's one reason you might have a right based on, again, the interests of citizens. Another interest that is super important is, let's say you have a corporation that forms a newspaper. It's created by a political party or a union. The people who are coming together to work and fund and so on that organization came together specifically to have a political point of view. And if you don't recognize their right, then you're shutting down our ability to organize and get our voice out there. Right? So there are a number of reasons that you would find corporations to have the basis to have a right to engage in political speech. On the other hand, there are very well-known worries, such as you're bringing up or are on the cover of the book. Just a little thing I talk about actually is Adam Smith talks about corporations. I think he has the British East India Company in mind, but I can't be sure. But he talks about how they threaten and intimidate lawmakers and socially control them. And that's all in Adam Smith. You can find it in the book. And so there are a lot of worries about too much corporate power and it taking over the system. And so this is another one of those trade-offs. The trade-offs is, how do we allow the information that that citizens need to hear? How do we allow that flow? How do we allow people to get their viewpoints expressed and together with each other? And how do we control corporate power from getting too great? That is one of these wicked problems that involve trade-offs. And different societies are going to make different determinations of how to manage all those trade-offs. You might, for example, have a complete ban on corporate money in the political process. Or you might decide, well, we'll let you have a small amount of money, 5,000, 10,000, 100,000, so on. Or you might decide, I think it's a bad choice, right, to allow unlimited amounts of money. And but what I do argue is that it's a democratic decision. I'm going to add one more thing just because it hasn't come up in our talk so far. But a lot of what I do in the latter part of the book is talk about, yes, corporations have abstract rights that should be democratically determined. But when you look out in the actual world, you find that corporate rights are often determined in an undemocratic or anti-democratic fashion. And so there's a long history of looking of legal scholars, for example, looking at that history. So I'm only arguing for corporate rights that are democratically controlled, and I do look at the cases where the process of making rights gets captured by corporate interests. And that raises a whole different set of ethical questions.
Dr. David, the book explores how corporations should act when they are implicated in attacks on democratic norms. What ethical framework should guide corporate decision making in such moments?
So, yeah, so this is a super hard question, is what ethical framework should guide corporate decision making in such moments? And then I might just go to what framework. I'm going to leave off the ethical for a second. So first, let's just take ethics out of the picture altogether. When an aspiring authoritarian or aspiring autocrat is making demands on you. Like they say, fire this person because they're critical of us and we don't want you to employ them anymore. Or they say, send us money, or send me, me personally, right? The autocrat might say. Um, if we just take ethics out of the equation altogether, you have to realize how risky it is to say yes. Okay? So when you capitulate, when you give in to the demand, you are not just giving them what they want, the person fired or the money, you're also giving them more power. Right. And if you give them more power and your competitor gives them more power and then other people in society give them more power, what they have is way more power and they are going to come back to you the next time, and this is certainly the risk, and they're going to ask for more. They're going to ask for more money. They're going to ask for more political compliance. So, in a sense, if you're leaving ethics out of the consideration, the best time to resist autocratic demands is now. Okay? Now, there's some strategic or tactical considerations to consider. You don't just go like literally right now, you look for your right moment, you make partnerships, you find who's with you, right? But it's not to wait till it really gets bad. This is the time. Right? So that's without putting ethics into it. Um, so when you put ethics into it, it just makes it even stronger that we have an obligation to everybody in society to have a society that has the rule of law, separation of powers, free and fair elections, doesn't target vulnerable minorities. That's just something that we owe, even when we're in our business roles. We owe to everybody in society. So that just makes it even more important. So finally, you asked the question, what ethical framework? I'll just say a little bit here. I mean, I very much feel and empathize with business leaders who are these demands are being put upon them. I'm not sure you know the case of ABC and Jimmy Kimmel, where the government went to some of the TV stations and said, basically get rid of this comedian who's making fun of the president. And what happened in that case is he was not fired, he was suspended. And then within a week, there were allegedly, I don't know the numbers here, 1 million people canceling their Disney subscriptions. So it's a parent company. Uh, uh, and the company reversed itself. Right. Now, what do I look at there? Were they just thinking about money? Right? Maybe. Or it could have been that the people inside never wanted to fire him in the first place. And it could be that what they found was a way to craft their response in a way that they were able to stand up. And it's ABC and Disney. These are large organizations, and I really want to believe, and I do believe that many of the decision makers within that space found a way to do what they knew was the right thing.
Professor, if policymakers adopted your person-based theory of the firm, what legal or regulatory reforms would you expect to follow?
Yeah. So, um, in one sense, what I argue for is that that they should make their decisions democratically, and to a large extent, that is a goal of many societies already. But what I do when I kind of go into that psychological or psychoanalytic point of view is I think some people on the policy side um, tend to pathologize or demonize corporate behavior. They make the assumption that they're always out just to make money and will do anything, engage in human rights abuses, pollute, so on and so forth. That is a sign of a dysfunctional relationship, right? And it is toxic, right? In a way, if you treat people in the business community like that, they will respond by, I talked earlier about they may become antagonistic towards democracy and the rest of democratic society. And we're seeing evidence of that. So, one thing that I would like to do is to have everyone in society work to de-escalate. Um, and to move away from this mutually hostile relationship to one of, if not love, at least of grudging respect, right? You have your role, we have our role, we'll be in conversation. Um, and um, so I don't know if yeah. So I had an analogy. It's not necessarily like a marriage. It's more like between parents, divorced parents raising a child, right? There's it's got to be done with respect, right? They're working together on the child or the children. So the question is, how do we work together to create a society that's economically productive and distributively just and that works for human beings? And that's something that's really in the interest of everybody. Um, did I answer your question?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Dr. David, I'd like to conclude this episode with one last question. Looking
Yeah.
ahead, what would a healthy relationship between corporations and democratic societies look like in practice? And what role do you see for business leaders in achieving that vision?
Okay. Yeah. So again, this kind of gets to the what I talk about in the in the conclusion of the book, things that I didn't anticipate when I started. If the book cover is showing an antagonistic relationship, I'm trying to argue that there's a way to have a more respectful one. And what will it take? And the one part, it will take a lot of society looks at business and sees only bad. And they'll blame all the ills of the world on some corporation doing this or that. And in a way, I think that's an immature way of thinking about the world. We're all implicated in businesses. I'm sitting here using devices and electricity and wearing clothes. These all eating food, right? This all came through the capitalist system, through businesses. I am implicated, and so are they, right? So if you pick out one person or one group or one sector in society and you throw all the evils on them, it's an ancient form of scapegoating. It's not fair. It's not accurate. It's not right. And it's also part of a toxic relationship. So one thing I would like people in society to do is to de-escalate, bring it down and say we can criticize without demonizing. We can work together to make things better, right? That's on the part of society. If we move specifically to the business community, the flip side is that there are within the business community, and I see this just in talking to people, but also in what's written over half a century, is this idea that everybody in society is against us. They don't understand the good that we do. We literally have the word is we're being besieged. I remember this here in Vancouver, Canada, but it's around the world in after the global financial crisis, we had the Occupy Wall Street movement. Well, there is like people are saying we're being surrounded and siege because you're trying to occupy. The language is literally there. But that's a mentality in business is when they feel like they're under siege, then they will circle and then they will defend themselves. Right? I think that businesses and business people need to stop this siege mentality. They have to see that they have to be willing to hear the criticism, the legitimate criticism that is coming towards them, and say, how can we do better? How can we together work together to make a society that's more uh, democratic, more human, and more humane, and more just, right? And what I believe is that we can do this, right? That business people and businesses and governments and citizens and NGOs and all these different groups throughout society can come together and create another form of capitalism. Right? It still capitalism, still has corporations with capital engaging in market competition with each other, but it's going to have a different orientation, one that is more human and humane. And that is one that is worthy of respect by everybody in society and would be the basis of a relationship that I was talking about before. And this kind of capitalism is possible, and it is much better than the most brutal form of capitalism that we sometimes practice, and some people think is the only way.
Thank you, Dr. David Silver, for sharing these profound insights. Your book, Corporations and Persons, A Theory of the Firm in Democratic Society, challenges us to rethink the moral and democratic dimensions of corporate life. It invites both scholars and business leaders to see the firm not merely as an engine of profit, but as a moral participants in sustaining democratic values. We truly appreciate your time and the depth of perspective you have brought to this conversation. Thank you once again.
Right. Thank you for hosting.